Two of the most important concepts to understand in contemporary video game culture. By contemporary, I mean the last 10 years of video game production, ever since the 3D video game became a major league art form and the video game industry became a powerhouse media with sales and revenues rivaling or surpassing those of the other branches of the mass media, surpassed film in about 2003, and last year video games surpassed DVD sales and revenue and rentals in terms of total revenue. These two concepts are globalization on the one hand and regionalization on the other. It's important to understand that what we call globalization in the world of media has a very different connotation from the kinds of meanings that people in the economic sphere, on Wall Street, and in the world of neoliberal ideology have claimed for the word globalization. Their term for globalization, their understanding of the concept, means an overwhelming homogenization of the world. The idea is that we live in one single world market. The barriers between economies have fallen, and therefore the world is simply a giant playground for capital to invest where it pleases. And along with this is the notion that the United States, it's the most globalized economy, will, for the benefit of all the other nations, run the state of affairs forever and be the primary economy in the center of this global network. This is inapplicable and wrong in the media culture for a number of reasons, but the most important reason is simply that it's not an adequate description of what actually exists. The world media culture is not centered in the United States anymore. Hollywood does not dominate world media production, does not dominate film production, does not dominate television production. All of the large nations of the world now watch and consume and produce mostly their own media. Some levels of imports here and there, but most of the big nations have thriving media cultures of their own, consume and produce their own media, have their own film cultures, have their own television, and increasingly video game cultures as well. So the kind of globalization that's resulted over the last 15 years has not resulted in homogenization. If anything, it's resulted in increasing differentiation. Regions of the world that have not had major league culture industries of their own have become emergent culture industries and have become massive producers and exporters of culture at a speed which shocks people like myself who still remember the days of the Cold War. There's very little in the historical record to compare with just the explosion of media from all aspects of the world, from Latin America, West Africa, South Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East, China, Southeast Asia. As I said, the 20 largest nations in the world by population have all become massive producers of media. And this is a process which is accelerating. It's not slowing down, it's not going off the rails, it's accelerating. And will continue to accelerate in the next 5 to 10 years. The second concept I want to talk about is the concept of regionalism. And it's important to stress that by regionalism, I'm not referring to processes which are limited to the level of a province or a subnational phenomenon. One of the classic examples would be Thomas Mann, the great German writer, and literary analysts have analyzed his works in terms of the blend of North German and South German tropes. These were cultural differences that were very important earlier in Germany's history, less important today, but they're there in Thomas Mann's work, and his work represents an interesting synthesis and unification of those two elements. Unfortunately, this is not a model, a particularly effective model for understanding what's happening with transnational media and the kind of regionalization happening in that media. And the best way to think about what's happening today is to simply add the adjective, transnational regionalism. This is a kind of a regionalism which it's based in certain places in a nation state, but it involves networks which cross several national borders at once. Sometimes those networks will be within nation states and other geopolitical entities that are near at hand. They might be neighbors. So a lot of the European hip-hop cultures have this. They borrow from other hip-hop cultures that are across the border. So Paris will influence Berlin, which will influence Frankfurt, which will influence Italy, so on and so forth. There are other kinds. Another good example would be the Hong Kong action films of the 80s and 90s, the great John Woo films, action films, which reinvented the action genre. If you look carefully at how those films are constructed, they're powerfully regionalistic documents. Hong Kong itself is a strange meeting ground, a melting pot for people all over China who tried their fame and fortune, came to Hong Kong to try to succeed, to escape the past, or for whatever reason, and created a new kind of culture, a culture that borrowed from the Chinese mainland and its media culture, its media tradition, which goes back to Shanghai. Shanghai was the first film city in Hong Kong, later took up the torch. But also from other countries in East Asia. South Korea's media culture, Philippines had a significant media culture, and especially Japan's media culture. John Woo also borrowed extensively from the Hollywood action epics and action genre. And the result was that he blended all those elements together and created works of art which spoke to several East Asian spaces at once. You could watch it in Hong Kong and understand, you could watch it in Tokyo and understand, you could watch it in Beijing and understand it, you could watch it in Seoul, South Korea and understand it. And it was one of the first truly pan-Asian works of art to do that. It was a huge hit in its day. His films were enormously successful all across the East Asian region because they expressed that sort of regional dynamism of a certain part of the world that had started to trade with itself, to grow together, and to learn to appreciate its neighbors' cultures. Another example of this regionalization process, which is a culture that many people may not necessarily know about, and that is the hip-hop culture in Moscow, Russia. Few people today, when you think of hip-hop, you think of American cities or Paris or some European cities. You might not necessarily think of Moscow. And yet Moscow has produced some amazing hip-hop artists in the last 5 years. Truly extraordinary, top-notch artists, ranging from groups like Caste, Suryoga, whose work has appeared in Grand Theft Auto 4 and other venues, and a range of other artists producing world-class music. Quite extraordinary, because the hip-hop scene in Moscow, it does not borrow from, or it's not limited to American cities. So it's not a simple clone or copy of things that are happening in other countries. Rather, the musical materials that are sampled, cited, and quoted by hip-hop artists come from all over Eurasia. They come from other parts of Russia, they come from other regions, they come from Ukraine, from Belarus, Kazakhstan, they come from the European Union, they come from Brazil. There's an extensive network, an amazingly dense network of sonic and acoustic references to all over the Eurasian landmass, and have somehow concentrated and transformed into something, to a very remarkable, interesting aesthetics in the work of the leading work of the Moscow hip-hop culture. So this regionalization process, this regionalism is immensely productive, and it's immensely cosmopolitan and attuned to global shifts in a way that previous regionalisms were not necessarily associated with or linked with. So this is a big change from the past.